Hello, Warp Factor. This is Alex Wallace, writer of the Weekly Book Talk feature, and today starting what is hopefully a new feature on Warp Factor, which I am tentatively calling Author Talk, where we bring on various authors from all over science fiction and fantasy, and just give it on for a short interview or whatever it turns into. So first off, we will be having Sean Patrick Hazlett, who has edited two anthologies from Baen Books, which are frankly kind of terrifyingly relevant as of recording on March 5th, 2022. Weird World War III and Weird World War IV. Mr. Hazlett, let's get to introduce yourself.
Yeah, so my name's Sean Hazlett. I am an Army veteran, an editor, and science fiction, fantasy, and horror writer. These two books, Weird World War III, Weird World War IV. Weird World War IV came out last week on Tuesday, and then Weird World War III came out in 2020, and that's the one that's been unfortunately particularly relevant today. The premise behind that one was, what if the United States and the Soviet Union had fought a conventional World War III, but that war had weird science fictional characteristics. So when I say that, what I mean is, to kind of simplify things, is think Stephen King meets Tom Clancy. And we're kind of getting all of that except for the Stephen King part in Russia, Ukraine right now, unfortunately.
I mean, it's just one of those incidences where the reality has to emulate fiction and not the parts of fiction we would want it to emulate. Like, it's like how in 1907 H.G. Wells wrote a book about strategic bombings, and in 1914 wrote a book about an atomic bomb, and he died in 1946. So,
well, you want to see something scary? I wrote a short story in 2017. It was actually in Baen's Best of Military Science Fiction, I think, in 2018. It's called Swarm, and it's about a U.S. Special Forces unit in Ukraine fighting Russians.
Oh boy, that.
Yeah.
I mean, this is what happens when you have a genre predicated about the future. So,
yeah. So in other words, this is not the first time I've kind of come up with something like that.
I mean, with some of my short fiction, I've done that. I've inadvertently predicted things like this too. Like, one short story I wrote came out like a month before it was revealed there was mass sterilization going on in an ICE facility in Georgia, and it was about a world where the U.S. gets state-run healthcare during the New Deal, and then it becomes used for mass sterilization because, yeah. Anyway, so something marginally less depressing, if only because it has a lot of explosions going on. Okay, so this is a very basic question. What made you want to start with Weird World War III? Why this theme? Why this?
It was mainly because I was kind of the one person in the world who had the right background to do that. And what do I mean by that? Well, when I was in the military, I was stationed at a place called the National Training Center in Fort Irwin, California, in the Mojave Desert. And what I did there is I was what people in the military call Op 4, which is just short for opposing forces. And we would run these massive force on force war games with, 5,000 people, in the desert, 200 plus tanks, armored vehicles. We had like a advanced version of laser tag. We would track where all the vehicles were and replay battles in the desert. And through the course of that, I was an officer at the turn of the century. So we were still training U.S. forces using Soviet doctrine and tactics. So what's really eerie is on one of so I have two websites. On one of my websites, actually both of them, but I have an article I wrote about fighting like the Soviets in Armor magazine, which is the military's, or the armor branches version of like a professional journal. What is a professional journal? In fact, Patton wrote articles in there way back when. So people are checking it out, which is really creepy, because it's about how to defeat the Russians, basically, or how to. Yeah, it's a little bit different. It's specific toward the opposing forces, but regardless, I'm an expert in Soviet doctrine and tactics. So that was kind of point number one. Point number two is I'm also a science fiction writer, fantasy writer, horror writer, mostly horror and science fiction. And I also do a lot of military science fiction in terms of a subgenre. So again, I have that particular background and expertise. And then I also spent time as part of an organization called the Harvard-Stanford Preventive Defense Project. And that was run by Dr. Ash Carter, who, and this is just when I was in graduate school, and he was my thesis advisor. He ultimately became Obama's Secretary of Defense. So that sort of background, made sense when it came to, who would you want to edit this particular anthology? Because I can inform when people start talking about the Red Army and things like that. I can say what works and what doesn't. And that's kind of how it came about. I pitched it to Tony Weisskopf, the publisher at Baen, and I had pitched a few things before, and it was like, no. And most of the time, it's like, who is this guy? Like, why is he pitching me? But this one interested them, and she gave me a shot, and this is what came out of it.
Interesting to hear. So since with your defense background, was there, just before we get to the anthology, just one question I want to ask. Did you sort of use science fiction in any way in creating these in these war games? Because I hear that science fiction is very popular among certain elements of the military. Like I know that the Marine Corps officer reading list had Starship Troopers on it. So, would you say that the thought processes of this were applicable to science fiction, or vice versa?
We certainly had to be fairly creative, right? And we would do things to U.S. forces that I probably can't repeat here. But no, seriously. But like, there's little things you can do that can trick the human psyche in order to get like a tank column to stop right at an ambush site. But yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say science fiction, but I would say that we definitely tried a lot of different things, and there are other things too which are pretty customary, like deception minefields. So not real minefields. Like I would get paper plates from Walmart, like blue paper plates from Walmart, and put them and lay them out like a minefield, and I could stop a tank column. Right? Because anything you do to break the space, to make the environment, or to do something to make a particular part of the environment stand out, will catch somebody's eye, and they'll stop. And you just arrange those things so that they see that those minefields perpendicular to, or you place them perpendicular to where you have your ambush set up. So there were a lot of things like that we would do that would be fairly successful, that would work on any military throughout the world. Particularly people who are fighting, a foe that can overmatch them. Particularly, like the Ukrainians. Even at the National Training Center, we as OPFOR, we knew the terrain, but our equipment sucked. Like it wasn't. We were operating in these old Sheridans, right? Which I don't think anybody else in the Army used them at the time, but they were like, driving around in rowboats in the desert, because they were just like, they weren't as smooth as M1 tanks. They weren't as accurate, and they were visually modified to look like T-80 tanks. So I wouldn't say we quite use science fiction. And the other thing too is like we also employed chemical weapons, right? Not real chemical weapons, but we fought like the Soviets did. So we would calculate the like wind speed, wind direction, so they didn't blow back in our faces. We would use persistent, non-persistent chem, right? Persistent, like once you slime an area, it's contaminated for a long time. Non-persistent is stuff that kind of fades away after you use it. But we trained the U.S. Army to deal with that kind of stuff, and we used it to our advantage. So if we wanted to keep them out of a particular place, we would drop persistent chem. If we wanted to push them in another direction, we would drop persistent or non-persistent chem or chemical attack on their flank and push them into an ambush. We would use fast cam, like family of scatterable mines, right, which is artillery launched minefields. So like we fought like the Russians fight. So I have a kind of a pretty good perspective of how they prosecute war. Actually, it's so eerie that we were talking before this interview that you had started a YouTube channel, or that you were considering starting a YouTube channel. I started one in late January, and on January 26th or 27th, I forget when the episode aired, I not only predicted that the Russians were going to attack, I predicted what their strategy would be, i.e. the encirclement of Kiev or Kyiv. I gotta start using the Ukrainian terminology. And that's kind of what happened. So again, it's the YouTube site's called Through a Glass Darkly, but I encourage people to check out the Sean McFade interview to see that. But I fought like them for so many rotations and battles that I can kind of get inside Putin's head. It's really scary, actually. Anyway, I'll stop talking. That's a lot. That's a lot.
No. It's interesting. It's interesting. I'm certain many Warp Factor readers would find that interesting. I mean, it reminds me of an article by a IR academic at I think University of Massachusetts Amherst, who was talking about how he had been playing a lot of real-time strategy games in his, and I quote, misspent middle age, and he was very, very scared to see the coverage of Ukraine, the Russians deploying weapons he had seen in the game and being, if anything, scarier than they were in the game, because they're like civilians here and not just the ahistorically empty map of so many games like this. So yeah, just it's the weird difference between simulation and reality that I think would be very odd to many people, very disconcerting to many people. I mean, it reminds me of, in a sort of grim way, how, I mean, one of the fathers of modern like miniature wargaming is H.G. Wells, and he said that if this is popular, maybe we can have less wars because all the aggressive energy would be spent on the games and on actual war. It's like, yeah.
Well, that's why we have sports. That's why we have sports. Seriously.
Very true. Very true. I mean, American football, it looks almost like a gladiatorial match, just with more people in it. I mean, they have the whole get up and they're all rapping into each other, and it probably looks like, I don't know, Greek hoplites. I'm not a military historian to the level to make a proper comparison, but on a certain gut level, I think it's pretty clear.
It's good for a population. Same with hockey, right? It's good for a population to get their energy out in a productive way instead of a destructive way.
Absolutely. And so, I wonder if this sort of science fiction and fantasy has kind of a similar thing, but like more the like instead of designing weapons in reality to kill people, you're designing weapons in fiction to sell as stories to publishing houses, which
Well, there's an intellectual, there's a physical side, which is sports, right? And there's an intellectual side, which is exactly what you're talking about, right? And this is, unfortunately, the physical side doesn't really spill over, but the intellectual side can and does sometimes.
yeah, absolutely. I'm reminded of okay, when I was younger, I had a Catholic youth Bible, and it had all these inlets which were preachy, which is what you expect for a Bible, honestly. And it's talking about you have to be intelligent to build an atomic bomb. And so that's what it reminds me of. Like, I mean, there's a Martin Luther King quote from one of his sermons, and which I will admit that I learned through Civilization 5. Our technological power has outrun our spiritual power. We have guided missiles and misguided men, which I think is also relevant here. Uh,
Yeah, I agree with that.
I mean, it probably hits differently during like the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it's the real possibility of being bombed to Kingdom Come. But then again, the Russians are getting really close to Romania and Poland, so maybe we could get to live it in real life here.
I hope not. I don't think any side is that dumb.
Okay, so on that very macabre note, so let's shift gears a little bit. Since so you've edited two anthologies with Baen, and so that's a sort of thing that involves a different skill than just writing it, because you basically have to be the shepherd for a flock of sheep, and all the sheep are writers, and they're giving you stories. I mean, I've edited one anthology for Sea Lion Press, Aloe Americana, with among others with fellow Warp Factor writer Matthew Kressel, and so I've learned what it takes to go into that, and it was over a year of just herding cats. So, Mr. Hazlett, how did that process go for you in the making of these two anthologies?
So in my, you know, kind of day job life, I've run kind of large organizations. I also ran large organizations in the military. The military is a lot easier. But when you work in corporations, uh, you know, it's a pain. It's a real pain. People don't turn things on time. They don't. So the one thing that helped is having managed privates in the U.S. military. You have to assume they're going to screw up. You have to assume they're going to be late. You have to assume that they might be fussy. So you just plan for all that. And the way that you plan for that is you give very clear instructions on kind of what the three elements of the story are, right? So in Weird World War III, it had to be a war between the U.S. and Soviet Union on the conventional side. It had to involve, well, it's two things. It had to involve a weird element, and that was it. And then what I would do to manage that process so that somebody didn't turn in a story that was about the U.S. versus Brazil and had was a spy thriller, which obviously wouldn't fit into the anthology. I asked people to submit just a log line, like a one sentence description of what their story would be about. That way I could prevent people from turning in duplicative stories or stories that were too similar that I'd have to reject. So I would manage it at the front end. I would also give them, I don't know if I should say this. I'll just say this publicly. Hopefully none of the authors watch this. I would pad my deadlines, right? I would give earlier deadlines, fully expecting, people to turn them in late, because when I'm about to miss a deadline, I am not a friendly person. Like, I am ruthless. Like, I am an animal. And I don't want to put writers face to face with that creature, because they will not like what they see. So when predictably 40% of them were late, right? It's not as bad. The other thing that I try to do is I try to process the stories as soon as I get them, within a week. Now, I haven't been doing that recently because the next anthology, I have a lot more wiggle room. But well, actually, I have been doing a little bit. I just haven't been doing it as quickly. But I try to process within a week. I have one story right now that I've been kind of pushing off. But I'm gonna, I've let the author know I'm going to buy it. But I just haven't gone through the detailed edits. But what you should do is edit them as they come in, so that when you're on deadline as an editor, you don't have this tsunami of submissions that you have to get through. That way, if people don't have, if people are late, it's not that bad because you're focused on these other stories. And then when you don't have any stories to edit, then you start, reaching out to them. Is it ready? Is it ready? Is it coming? And I would say about a month before your deadline, that's when you reach out for the pitch hitters, right? And you give them a chance to submit something. And then if somebody doesn't, who you already asked, doesn't turn in their story by that time, tough, right? Sorry, like it's like 3 months late, buddy. Not going to be in the anthology. But for the most part, they've all been great. And the other thing too is the fancier the writer you are, the later your story is going to come in, and the more accommodative you have to be as an editor. Because, and it's not that they're lazy or they're vain or they think they're great. It's just that really good writers are in high demand, so everybody's asking them for anthologies, so they're overwhelmed, and you have to, you can't really blame them. You're gonna have to blame the game, right?
Right.
Don't hate the player, right? Hate the game. So you have to understand that and work through that. But I like to run a very tight ship. I don't like to miss deadlines. I like to get it in. But again, I have that background, right? I was a captain in the U.S. Army. I've run finance departments in corporations. I've had to manage budgets and make sure that we either met or exceeded those budgets. So that part of the process, I think I do pretty well. It's something I could probably do two or three of these a year pretty easily.
I see. I mean, what it sounds like you did was like far better than what I did, and the deadlines were pushed back multiple times, and I was kind of lazy about it at times, but it eventually came into being and finally got published like a year and a quarter after I initially pitched it to the publishing house. So, I mean, it sounds like to me you ran this with a sort of military mindset, which I feel like is more efficient than probably a lot of the civilian mindsets that happen throughout publishing nowadays. Just because,
Yes, I'll say it right here. Like, well, I should be careful. So on the point on the at the tip of the spear, the military is one of the best organizations on the planet in terms of most efficient, and people working together and everybody pulling their weight. Their bureaucracy is one of the worst, right? It's terrible. But and part of the reason you get that is everybody has the same values. In corporations, there's the politicos who do 2% of the work, and then there's kind of a group of people who do who are about 20% of the population, and they do 80%, right? But the politicos are the ones who do extremely well, which is extremely, like in the military, you're a politico. You might be able to get away with it during peacetime, but during wartime, you're exposed, right? And it's pretty clear that you're not pulling any weight and you're gone, either through death or you're relieved of duty.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's this. I mean, from me, a civilian, what looks like the military has this way of calculating threat that is just in it to its being because it's a military, and to some degree that they know they have to cut the chaff because they need to be efficient. And as we've seen with many corporations, they don't always feel the need to be efficient. I mean,
Well, they feel the need to be efficient, but there are forces in those organizations that you know, counteract that, right? Like nobody's going to die if you make a mistake, right?
right,
So even with communications, like in the military, communication is brutally direct because there's no time for BS,
yeah,
right? It's just like get out of the effing way. There's a missile coming at you, right? And there's a missile coming at you is not really even part of it. It's just like get the F down, right? Whereas you communicate that way in a corporation, you're gonna, somebody's gonna get upset and complain about you and this and that. So it's less efficient because there are techniques you can employ in the military that would be completely unacceptable in civilian life, and for good reason, right? But it also drags on efficiency.
right. I mean, from what it looks like to me, it's like, have you read the Centurions by Jean Lartegui, the French guy who wrote about the French troops in Vietnam and Algeria? And it talks about how one of the soldiers he profiles is this rich guy, this rich Frenchman, and he gets a job doing nothing at his father's corporation just so he can have an income. And Lartegui kind of draws a contrast between that and the relative efficiency of the French military. So I don't know if that sounds accurate to you. Does that feel like it's hitting on something to you?
Yeah, it definitely does. I would say there's less nepotism in in U.S. corporations, but it's there, and it is absolutely destructive. Like those people are absolutely useless, and they cause a lot of issues too because they're worthless. So there's actually a German. I should be quoting a Wehrmacht general, but I will. And the reason I will is because remember General Erich Shinseki,
Yes.
who was the general who told Congress we'd probably need on the order of several 100,000 to control Iraq, and he was fired for it, but he was right.
Yeah.
Um, they had organized when I was in graduate school. They had organized a breakfast for ROTC cadets and veterans in graduate school who were being taking courses at the time. So a bunch of us got to have breakfast with him, and he came up with or he said there's a general. This is where I first heard it. A general von Manstein, General von Manstein in Germany. In fact, he was the German general who captured the Crimea. Right. So that's a kind of interesting historical fact. And he said that there were 4 types of officer. Okay. He called it it's called the von Manstein matrix. And they were on 2 dimensions. Okay. One was intelligence and one was industriousness. Okay. So the officers who were extremely intelligent and extremely industrious or hardworking, those are your staff officers. They will make sure that no detail is left unmet. Okay. Then there were the highly intelligent but lazy officers. Those are your general officers. They will do they will make sure everything that is absolutely necessary is done without doing more than that, right? They will exert the minimum effort to get for the maximum result. Then there are the lazy and stupid officers. Leave them alone. They're harmless. Then there are the stupid and industrious officers. You are to spend 100% of your time culling them from your military because they will do more damage to any to your organization than you could possibly imagine. And it's the same thing is true in corporate. Right?
Right. I mean, I think it was Bill Gates who said that if I want something solved, I'll give it to a lazy person, so he'll make the most efficient solution to it as possible. and it feels like a very similar thing.
A little bit. I wouldn't give it to the lazy person. Like it'll never get done. It's just you just let them handle the politicians. Just go and go deal with this guy. Schedule meetings with him.
I mean, and also I have to say that the whole stupid and industrious will ruin you thing feels very accurate for the Wehrmacht. Just, I feel like that was a problem throughout Nazi Germany. And I mean, it was good for humanity, obviously. And the whole thing with Hitler deliberately setting his people against each other, it just, it feels like a very cogent observation of what was around Manstein. And I'm not
Yeah.
sure if he was able to say that openly then, because it might be politically inconvenient. But
Yeah, but that's exactly how he managed his generals, right?
yeah,
He set them against each other. And those environments are horrible to be in, by the way.
yes, that's of my limited experience. I feel like I've been in at least one job where they did that, and it was miserable.
Yeah.
Yes, and okay, so shifting gears again, in light of recent events, given that you described your anthologies as Tom Clancy meets Stephen King, do you think that there'll be a boom in this sort of fiction in the next few years, given we're seeing it happen in real time in Ukraine, and you're seeing what would be a wargamer's dream, except the fact that it's happening in reality? So, do you think this sort of fiction will become more relevant in the next few years?
I kind of have two minds on this. I think it can go either way. The data, if I look at kind of just looking at ranking of the book on Amazon as a proxy, there's definitely more interest, right? It's definitely, and I'm not sure if it's correlated with my book launch of the Weird World War IV, or if it's correlated with this event, but it definitely started ticking up or Weird World War III definitely started ticking up in ranking. It's an older book, right? So over time, these things tick down in rank. It's definitely correlated with recent events. So, so there could be renewed interest in these sorts of things. On the other hand, it could go the other way, right? Like, I mean, let me ask you a question. What's your view on the interest in science fiction about pandemics? Do you think it's increased or gotten less? People are less interested in it.
So I think there are different segments in the market, some of which very much were engaged by pandemic stuff. But on the other hand, I do know at least one reviewer who adamantly refused to review anything involving pandemics, even to read it, because he said it's too real. And so, I mean, I think a part of it is that most of the science fiction readership is not in Ukraine. Ukrainian science fiction readers may not want to because they're seeing the bombs drop right in front of them. I mean, but at least in the English speaking world, it's kind of abstract for us because I mean two of us are in the U.S., UK is in Western Europe are in the line of fire, and so there it could escalate. And I think it was Paul Anderson who said, "An adventure is someone freezing and starving to death far away from you."
Yeah.
So I think that's a dynamic that you could be seeing in the areas not in the line of fire within Ukraine itself, and maybe the Baltics, maybe Poland, Romania, Bulgaria. Maybe it'll go down because they're seeing it right there, and it's like, no, this is horrible. We're seeing people die in airstrikes and all that. So I think it's going to be heavily regional, and I think it's going to be heavily dependent on who's interested in what, and there'll be different market segments operating in different ways. That's what my gut is telling me.
I certainly hope so, right? For selfish reasons that people, consume consume more. And I mean, the other thing too is the Chinese have an organization. I think it's called like the I can't remember the exact. It's the future. It's the future something. But what the Chinese have astutely recognized is that in the 50s and 60s, the U.S. had a ton of science fiction, right? And then that science fiction, like if you talk to any astronaut or rocket engineer, right, they'll mention that influenced them in kind of developing technology to get into space. So what the Chinese have done are they are actively encouraging the development of their own nascent science fiction industry in order to encourage that transfer in the long run. It's pretty smart. Unfortunately, we are not that smart. We just happen to have done it, and it happened to have been effective. So, to some extent, it's a good way for a civilization to generate ideas, because these ideas can be made into reality.
I mean, I wonder if that's why, because just by sheer coincidence, I'm reading that new anthology of Chinese science fiction, Synopticon, which came out a couple months ago. I was reading it before I got onto this call, and like what has always struck me about the translated Chinese stuff is that it feels like American or British stuff from the 1950s or 1960s to me. In a way I can't quite put my finger on, but like I could see a lot of these stories published in like Analog or Asimov's in the Golden and Silver Ages if you were to swap out all the Chinese names for white guy names. Like I think they're kind of in that phase right now. But what's really interesting is that this is state run in a way it never was in the United States.
Right.
I mean, there was the whole push for young people science education in this country in the 50s and 60s because they wanted like rocket scientists because they were afraid there's going to be a big war with the Soviet Union, as is in your anthology. I mean, in China though, it's feeling a very like they're trying to encourage the culture in a way that I think only a big communist state could do, because there's a whole philosophy there that the whole society is something that's state directed. And you could see this in the Soviet Union too. Because I remember I read in the 30s, 40s, 50s, the Soviets saw hard science fiction as being within proper socialist realism because it showed that their social model will win, it can lead to advances, that it could deliver on its promises. So I think you're seeing a similar thing in China right now. That they're deliberately reckoning with the future of their society in a way that I think Marxism as an ideology could encourage, because they believe that history goes in stages. There's feudalism, capitalism, socialism, communism. So I can see how that fits into that mindset, that you're deliberately thinking about what could be next. And so they've done that in their science fiction. They've done that in their popular film. And frankly, I think the written stuff is generally leaps and bounds better than a lot of their films, but that's a different subject. So yeah, absolutely. I think they're doing themselves a favor in thinking very forward and encouraging that broadly, and I don't think the West is doing that in the same way.
Well, I mean, they expect to reach kind of China having its own kind of Monroe Doctrine or sphere of influence in East Asia by a very specific date, by 2049. Like the Taiwan question will be settled, a number of things. Like they think in much longer time scales, where Americans are focused on like what the Kardashians did last week and what's on TikTok and some weird dance, right? So like we need to be very mindful of that. Like these guys think in very long stretches of history, and the West is very, thinks in much shorter time segments. Now, the advantage to that is we tend to adapt much faster than they do, but we're like sclerotic. We're all over the place. And if you're moving in the wrong direction, you can quickly shift, but still, like it doesn't appear to be any rhyme or reason to it.
Yeah, there's something to be said about the whole flexibility versus long-term view that, I mean, I'm hesitant to make any big generalizations because I think that's getting into some dangerous territory, but I've heard similar things said about the US versus Japan in a number of areas. Like, I've heard that American bomber pilots were far more adaptive than Japanese bomber pilots in the Pacific theater, but also during the 80s that Japanese corporations were much more forward thinking than American corporations who were just looking at that the next quarter and then the next quarter and then judging like 10 years future, which I mean, as I said, I don't want to say everyone from East Asia is a hive mind, which is obviously not true, but
Right.
maybe it's, I don't know, Confucian. What I'm saying is that from a very cursory viewpoint, it looks like they're doing this better than we are, and here we are on.
Yeah, it's basically a backhanded compliment, is what I was like. That I was kind of giving, but yeah, they both have their advantages, but right now that mindset, I think, is starting to pay off for China.
Yes, absolutely. And they're trying to outdo us culturally. I don't think they've succeeded yet.
They're terrible at that. They're absolutely terrible.
I mean, you want my opinion? They aren't good at getting the spontaneity in their mass culture, and when I say mass, I mean like state funded, that the West can get as of yet, because they think
as long as you censor anything, you're going to be behind. And that's what's scary about our culture, is that we have a segment that's trying to censor everything. And what people don't realize is, if you whatever you if you censor, you're going to get what you don't want, because what it does is it pushes bad ideas underground. And when bad ideas go underground, they fester, metastasize. People are attracted to bad ideas because of the allure that they provide. And you have a worse problem on your hands versus if you just had let the bad ideas sustain the power of sunlight and lose in the market for ideas. But I think the reason the Chinese won't succeed, at least in kind of the culture war, is because they censor and prevent people from being creative. Not in all cases, but in cases where they want to sanction certain things. We're much better at that, but we're slowly becoming much worse.
And I mean, and it's not like the Chinese don't have influence in Hollywood. It's why the Doctor Strange movie is set in Nepal and not in Tibet as originally. And like it's known that they have, because Hollywood wants Chinese money. I mean, it boils down to that. Hollywood wants Chinese money.
There's actually a huge nuance on that. So I have a friend who used to be the content acquisitions, or the head of content acquisitions at Hulu. And when I brought that very point up, what he said is, it depends. So if the budget of a particular film is astronomical and you have a ton of expensive stars and headliners, etc., you damn well better make sure that the movie doesn't offend China, and you work with China, because you need the access to that box office in order to make sure that you recover your costs. However, if you do a much lower budget film, Hollywood doesn't care. You can say whatever negative about China you like. And as long as it's cheap, you'll be able to make that film in Hollywood. I mean, there might be degrees to it, to the point where, China starts embargoing movies from that particular studio because they produce that other movie. So there's like a second order effect that you have to manage. But as long as it's the budget small enough, you can make pretty much anything you want without having to satisfy the Chinese mandarins.
I can see what you're saying, and it being Hulu, it reminds me. Recently, I watched their Catch-22 miniseries. Have you watched that? It's
A long time ago, I think.
it was
Yeah.
released 2019, but
Yeah.
I feel like it's the only sort of thing that can only be made in a liberal democracy, because I don't think any authoritarian state in any part of the world would ever let something this frank about the absurdities of the military ever be published, because these governments depend on their militaries to stay in power, and so they're going to take it as a slight, and they're going to ban it and probably throw people in jail. And then, as you said, the bad ideas get driven underground, and then they become attractive, and then it blows up in their faces.
Well, that's what's happening in the United States right now. Like the bad ideas have been driven underground, and they can't, like, the FBI can't monitor them because they're not being surfaced on social media, but they're definitely metastasizing. And the large technology companies are not 100% to blame, but to blame for that. So
yeah, absolutely. I think there very much is that effect going on. So yeah, sorry. So that's I think that was the last big question I had. Will this fiction be more relevant in the future given Ukraine? I mean, I know that the Chinese are thinking about this in at least a limited sense, because they essentially released their knockoff Black Hawk Down a couple years back.
is that
Operation
Wolf Warrior?
I was in Operation Red Sea.
Oh, what is that? I'm not familiar with it.
It's so it was based on a real incident where uh Chinese nationals got captured by, I think, terrorists in Yemen, and so the PLA sent a force to free them, and it felt a lot like Black Hawk Down to me, but it's just chest thumping Chinese nationalism instead of chest thumping American nationalism.
Is this was this based on a real incident, or this is just this is just a fiction?
It was based on a true story in the loose way that Hollywood often does. It's heavily fictionalized, but there's that kernel of truth that may have gotten lost somewhere. So yeah, I know that the Chinese are thinking about it. I mean, for their own good, the Russians had better be thinking about it, because they're not doing a very good job right now.
Well, they have a rich history of dealing with. Actually, it was actually a pretty short history of dealing with terrorists. Because I think in the 80s there was some like Aeroflot flight that was hijacked by terrorists in the Middle East, and the KGB figured out who the terrorists were, so they rounded up members of their families, killed half of them, dismembered them, and dropped the bodies on the tarmac, the body parts on the tarmac, and said, we're going to do the same to the other half if you don't release our nationals. And kind of for the most part, until after the end of the Cold War, the terrorists stopped messing with the Russians.
I mean, I suppose that's one of the benefits being an authoritarian state has when dealing with terrorism, because you have the kill them all option
Mhm.
that would, I think, justly never fly in the in a liberal democracy, because I mean, I don't think the U.S. as it currently stands to be able to get away with that without massive
No,
public
no, I'm
outrage.
not saying
I'm
I'm
not
not
saying
saying
it's
I
good.
endorse it.
No,
Yeah, I'm not
no,
saying
of
I
course not.
endorse it, but it's effective.
Yeah, it is in certain places and in certain times, and I mean, I think there's a good comparison to be drawn with Chechnya in the 90s,
Oh boy,
when
yeah.
when when Putin, I think it was Yeltsin, then Putin, they just shell the city relentlessly, and then they put Ramzan Kadyrov in charge, and he's still there.
Now, there is some context there. Let me tell you about the Chechens. So, in the first Chechen war, Chechen snipers would aim for the groin because it was humiliating, debilitating, and you have a low, slow, painful death. The other thing they would do is they would take Russian dead and wounded, hang their bodies upside down from windows so that the Russians would have to shoot their own soldiers to hit the Chechens. The third thing that they would do is at night, under cover of darkness, they would creep behind Russian positions and along the roadside to the entrance of Grozny, they would stick Russian heads on stakes so that new conscripts that rolled in would have to look at their comrades in the eye as they went to fight the Chechens. So, and then I have friends who would fight, who fought in Afghanistan, and from time to time they would come across the bodies of redheaded men, and because they were a bunch of Chechens that went to fight us, the United States military, and like they just, it's not like their cult. It's not in their culture to surrender, so they would fight to the death always. Never captured one. So in terms of like, it is a very brutish and ruthless culture. It's like a mountain. It's like a mountain culture, an honor culture. Very much like the Scots Irish in the U.S. And I have some Scots Irish heritage, and I
I mean,
understand it.
my last name's
Right?
Wallace.
Yeah. So it's like an honor culture. Like if you look at the South, people in the South, a lot of them derive from that heritage, and it's an effusively polite culture. And there's a reason for that. When you're kind of in the highlands, in the mountains, and you have a grazing culture where you have livestock, if your livestock wanders into your neighbor's uh, territory, you have to resolve your differences very quickly. And if they don't give your livestock back, you're going to starve. So there's a culture in the South. You go to the South, people are effusively polite, but are quick to anger, right? And it's very similar in Chechnya. You get that in these like isolated mountain communities where you have to be tough, and you have to be, you have to have these honor cultures in order to resolve differences that can very quickly turn into flashpoints.
I mean, what you described in the South, I mean, I would put it as politeness by virtue of mutually assured destruction. If
Yeah,
if I mean, not with nuclear weapons, literally, but from their perspective, it's that level of magnitude, because their livelihood depends on having the livestock, and if they don't have, if the livestock is taken, then you starve.
right.
So
But it's a cultural thing. It's a cultural thing that's been kind of there's a great, and by the way, I'm not making this up. This is not my idea, right? There's a Senator James Webb, right? It was a senator in Virginia. He wrote a book called Born Fighting, and it really talks about this culture. There's a lot of it in Appalachia in particular, right? Because again, you're in the mountains, that sort of environment. But even coming out here, where I am in California, I see things, in a different way than many of my neighbors, and it's still an adjustment, right? Because it's kind of a cultural heritage that you can't really move away from. But I don't take crap from anybody. I just don't.
I mean, I've read Born Fighting. I read a couple years back, and as I said, I'm from Virginia, so James Webb was one of my senators for a while, and so also Albion Seed by David Hackett Fisher talks about the Scots Irish, or as he argues the term borderer is more accurate, and
Yeah.
it came from this this warrior culture on the borderlands between England and Scotland, and it was a culture that was adapted to constant warfare because whenever England and Scotland would have a war, there'd be an army going one way or the other, pillaging the land, taking their food, taking their livestock, taking their women, and so it was a culture that was adapted to have to deal with that at any point. And I've read in a different book some of the like the English, and I mean like the people in London trying to deal with the border reavers, and it sounds a lot like 19th century white Americans describing Native Americans, like the annoying nomads who get in the way of the great things we want to do, and it, in that way, it's not really surprising that they got put in Appalachia because it was believed that they would adapt well to that environment, and they did. They very
Yep.
much did. And I mean, also they became the Protestant Northern Irish, which has led to many things, as one who is familiar with the region may see. So
Yeah, that's where at least on my father's side, my ancestors came from,
it's same
right? Like,
here.
yeah, yeah. So like, I think my family name, like they migrated from or emigrated from Scotland to Ireland long ago, and were kind of landlords in Northern Ireland. On my mother's side, I'm a Lynch, right? So like that's on the Irish side of not obviously not Northern Ireland, like County Cork sort of area.
Yeah.
So I definitely I definitely understand, and like just the way I approach conflict and things like that is very different than the way other people, at least in approach conflict, right? I'm very
Right.
confrontational, right? And not a lot of people are like that. They're like, not it's but it's efficient.
Yes, yes. And it absolutely makes sense certain certain environments. And I mean, a Marxist would call this material conditions, and I doubt if you agree with that particular with Marxism as a philosophy. I think in this case, it makes a lot of sense because
Yeah.
you're looking at the actual physical reality of where these people live and how the culture builds from there. I think in this case that works very well.
It's also how they choose their leaders too, right? Like if you look at an Anglo sort of culture, it's very hierarchical, very top down. I mean, like they have a queen, for Christ's sake, right? Whereas like someone like me is, like what, like like that person didn't prove themselves to me. Why should I follow them? Right? It's a very, like Anglo culture is very top down in terms of leadership. Like you're entrusted with the leadership because that's the role you've been granted. That's the role you're designed to fill, and people will follow you because you have that role. Whereas in this kind of Scots Irish sort of culture, it's a bottoms up sort of leadership. Like a leader doesn't become a leader unless that leader wins over his or her followers, right? And I find that way too. Like if I'm working for somebody and I don't respect you, like I gotta find another role because it ain't gonna go well,
Right.
right? Because I can become unruly, and I recognize it myself, and I recognize it can be irrational, but there's also this cultural strain. Like I have in the military, I did very well with authority. And I thought it was because I respected authority. It's not. I don't respect authority at all. I have a problem with it. But the military does such a good job of training its officers and selecting its officers. It's kind of a two-way street to have a certain kernel of leadership and then really developing that leadership mentality. And it's like very basic tenets, right? As an example, and this is U.S. Army in particular, because the Navy does some things a little weird, right? I.e., they have like a separate mess for the officers and enlisted, like that stuff. That won't cut in the Army. In the Army, you let your soldiers eat first. They eat first, you eat last, right? And it's just simple things like lead by example. So if they're digging ditches, you're digging ditches with them, right? If they're changing a Humvee tire, you're helping out changing a Humvee tire. You're able to do all the things that they're doing because that's the only way you're going to gain their respect. But that's not taught. Like a lot of business leaders don't understand that. And that's why like people wouldn't follow them into the Playboy Mansion.
I mean, so it's saying it's not just authorities that they make authorities feel earned.
That's right.
So there's that sense that this is a person who is worthy of being in that place, who is not just been dropped there. It says, listen to this guy because he's up there. This person has earned that title, earned that authority, and is going to prove it. And so I can absolutely see how that can be lead to a very healthy culture of leadership and authority in a way that a lot of private organizations just don't.
Right.
Because they view their workers as peons, as when you get the worst form, barely even human. And so you create an inherent instability there. And so there's always tension related to that in a way that, I mean, I'm not saying the military is immune from this because there have absolutely been mutinies in various militaries.
But, yeah.
But it feels like, as a civilian, that the military is thinking about this in a way that a lot of the private sector isn't. And I think that
there's a reason for that too, right? The military doesn't have a profit motive. Right. So you can be a horrendous leader. Like I'll take investment banking. I worked as an investment banker, right? The worst leadership I've ever seen. Like absolutely. Like if I were the CIA and I wanted to overthrow a regime, I would spend a year in investment banking and write a book, like a manual on like all their practices. And then I would seed it into my enemy's like political system and it would fall apart. In fact, the precursor to the CIA, the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, you can look this up, has a manual called the Simple Sabotage Manual. And there's a section in this manual on how to conduct meetings, right? Where like, okay, so when you want to slow things down, okay, let's form a committee on that. And then you come back like 6 months later. Oh, I never said that. We did. It literally recounts 50% of every meeting I've participated in corporate. It is like line by line. Somebody is almost as if somebody took that and thought about, okay, who wrote it? Let me think about every dysfunctional meeting I ever had. Let me put it in a manual and let me seed it into the German military. Right. So check it out. It exists. It's called the Simple Sabotage Manual.
Simple Sabotage Manual. I will link that when this goes live. But that sounds like something worth reading. I think I might have seen quotes of that going around the internet, especially among my more activist friends who like think the FBI is infiltrating them, and it's like, don't do the thing that the FBI uses to break you. And I mean, I think a lot of it goes again to the notion that leadership is something that is assumed, not earned, and that leaders who don't feel a need to justify their authority to the people beneath them end up making hideous mistakes, end up lying, and the whole thing comes tumbling down. What your whole thing about corporate leadership remind me of is George Orwell's essay Politics in the English Language, where he says that the reason why bureaucratic exospeak is so terrible is because it's ultimately an act of lying. And so people aren't saying what they actually want to be saying, so they come up with all sorts of nonsense that is supposed to make them look good, but doesn't actually make any sense. And Oral puts it as like a cuttlefish spurting out ink. From the way you describe it, it seems like that the military has ways to prevent this in a way that a lot of private organizations don't.
Yeah, I don't know if it's that they prevent it. I just think that they inculcate a leadership philosophy that checks it. Like, so I mentioned earlier that they also select the officers, right? Like there's a process before you get in where they, they take a psychographic profile, they do a psychographic profile of you. They do, a number of different things to at least ensure that you don't get a lot of, crazy or stupid people who come in. Like you're not going to get the brightest all times, right? But there's a certain baseline that you can't be a complete moron. Whereas in corporate, you could be the boss's son, right? And you could be an absolute moron, and people around you have to adapt and deal with that and kind of compensate for it to get around it. But in the military, it becomes very quickly it becomes very clear that you're incompetent, right? And you won't last very long, or somebody will just take over for you. Even in training, I can think of there's one training event in Scout platoon leaders course where there was an officer that was just struggling. So I kind of just politely and respectfully took control. The person was still the leader and the mission went successfully, but I kind of helped him out in a way that was a little brazen, but I tried to do it in a way that would help him succeed and didn't override him or was disrespectful. It was more like, hey, why don't you do this? Hey, why don't we, here's an idea. Why don't we do that? And in general, the military also selects officers who will appreciate that. So like I've had, one sergeant once came up to me. It's like, sir, this is effed up. I'm like, okay, what do you recommend we do then? And he gave me a recommendation. I'm like, all right, let's do it. Right. Whereas in the Russian military, right, like, I think only the officers, like in their gas masks, only the officers can transmit. Right. So if you see something happening and you're the lowest ranking conscript, there's nothing, you can't let anybody know. So, you're less apt to adapt, right? You're just not as, I don't know. But I think the point is that you have a screening process, and then you also have a focus on developing the best leaders because your currency is in lives, not in dollars.
Right.
Whereas if it's in dollars, sometimes it might actually be productive to abuse your staff because you might make more money in the short term. And if you're operating from quarter to quarter, that might work. It's a terrible long-term strategy, but you just care about getting things done. You don't care about processes much. You just care about getting it done. You don't care what the cost is, right? Or in terms of like how it impacts people. I do. Like I try to build processes that where you don't have to burn out staff to implement it, and it creates a predictable kind of tempo for the organization. But most people who get into these roles, they were great individual contributors or sycophants, right? A lot of them are sycophants, right? And when they ultimately end up in charge of something, they don't know what they're doing. And it's not necessarily their fault. They just don't know how to lead people. So anyway, that's a long rant. That's not really a rant, but it's kind of a pseudo rant.
It's relevant. And to go back to a point we were previously talking about, it strikes me as the sort of thing that you were trying to do when you're putting these two anthologies together. That sort of efficient leadership style, because as the editor, you are, in a sense, a leader creating a product, a book. And so I feel like that's a very good attitude to have when doing this, and something when I do my next anthology I should take cues from, because I wasn't very good at it with when I was doing my anthology.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, at the very beginning of the process, you let everybody know how it's going to go. On this date, this is going to be due. On this date, this is going to be due. Then you're going to get, a few months later, like, and I can't predict it because I don't, because there's a point at which the publisher runs part of the process, which is when the copy edits come and the galleys come. But you just let them know in advance, after we go through the edits and after I buy your story and pay you for your story, you're going to get some copy edits that come in, and I'm going to go through them, and then I'm going to recommend, and then I'm going to send it to you, and I'm going to recommend what to change and what not to change, but expect it. And then you're going to get galleys, and every once in a while, like, I can tell where I mismanaged the process, because an author will be like, "How come I didn't get this in track changes?" Well, it's the galley. Like, I should have told you it's the galley, right? It's just how it's going to look and things like that. But even like when I get a galley, galley proof, there's still some changes that I'll make, right? So I have a story called Manchurian that's coming out in another Baen anthology called Robo Soldiers in June, and my main character is a former, Delta operator, but as I looked at, after I edited it a billion times, my editor went through it, who's Stephen Lawson, caught things. Then, we did the copy edit, and I get this galley proof, and I noticed that I wrote Delta operative. Okay. Now, for the uninitiated, there are no Delta operatives. By law, you cannot call a Delta soldier an operative, because an operative is a spy and they're part of the US military. They're operators. So, like, I caught one little thing like that most people in the world wouldn't notice, but for Baen's community, which has a much higher proportion of military veterans and people who are currently in the military than probably any other population or audience, I guarantee a large number of them would notice it, and they would judge me for it, and they should judge me for it. So I fixed it, and it was fine. Anyway, I don't know what my point was there.
I mean, just about processes and editing, and having a good process for editing. And
That's
I mean,
right.
I understand the idea of not everyone will see me wrong, but if the small group sees me wrong, they're going to judge me, and they'll deserve it. I mean, I'm in the alternate history community. We have our own little shibboleths like that, and you need to be right about it, or otherwise they will rake you over the coals. And so there's an in-group out-group thing that I very much recognize, and this rings true to me. So yeah. And so, seeing that we've been going for about 80 minutes, and have used up all the big questions I had, Mr. Hazel, would you like to make any closing statements? Because I think we're going to start wrapping this up.
Yeah. So, number one, please do pick up copies of Weird World War III and Weird World War IV. You can find them in ebook, trade paperback, and then for Weird World War III, mass market paperback on Kindle, or your independent bookseller anywhere books are sold. So please check that out. I also encourage people, if they want to find more about me, look at Through a Glass Darkly. That's both a website and also a YouTube channel. So I started a YouTube channel in late January. And on that channel, I talk about all of the sorts of things that you would see in Real World War III and Real World War IV. And that includes just writing science fiction and fantasy. I interview a lot of authors in those anthologies. I also discuss very broadly geopolitics. As I mentioned earlier on this podcast, I accurately predicted not only that Russia would invade Ukraine, but also that they would seek to circle Kiev and do a kind of a change in leadership there. And I also talk about the paranormal, again, on the weird side, which is particularly where, declassified US military programs like remote viewing, the ATIP program that looked at Skinwalker Ranch. I talk about kind of where the US defense and intelligence agencies intersect with the paranormal. So I have a bunch of stories on that. So it's called Through a Glass Darkly YouTube channel. I highly encourage you to like and subscribe that that channel.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Hazlett, for coming on Warp Factor's author talks, and I recommend both of the anthologies, and I will most certainly be looking at that YouTube channel. Thank you very much for being here, and I think that's all. Signing off.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.